Start, and we started already recording. Your Eminence Archbishop Haygazun Najarian, ecumenical fathers and Armenian church fathers, very dear professors, Dr. Robert Irvine, brothers and sisters in Christ in Australia and in New Zealand. Friends, warm greetings from Auckland, New Zealand, to all who joined this online event. A very good morning to Professor Irvine in New York. It's Professor's second lecture about Jerusalem, delivered at 5 a.m. New York time. Thank you, Professor Irvine, for accepting to lecture again at 5 a.m. It's highly appreciated, professors. Thank you. Well, this lecture is the 34th in the series of online lectures organized by the Diocese of the Armenian Church of Australia and New Zealand, the fourth consecutive year. Some in English, but majority in Armenian language. As you noticed, it is being recorded, so please keep yourselves muted, except you, Professor. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the lecture. Ask questions by either writing in the chat box or raising your hands electronically or physically. Well, we usually start and close our lectures with a prayer. Therefore, I would like to invite His Eminence, Archbishop Najarian, to say the opening prayer. Your Eminence, please unmute.
First, I would like to thank Professor Irvine to join us. It's always fun and joy to see you and to hear you and to learn. Always there is something to learn from you. It doesn't matter one is a student of the seminary, Vartabet, bishop, archbishop, it doesn't matter. It's always fun to hear you. Thank you for your time and effort. Particularly in your time, it's very early in the morning. Անուն Եվորտո եւ Օգուի Սրբո ամեն հայր մեր որերգինս ես սուրբ եղիցի անուն քո եկեսե արքայություն քո եղիցին գամ քո որպես հերգինս եւ հերգրի ըսած մեր հանաբազոր դուր մեզ այսօր եւ թող մեզ զբարդիս մեր որպես եւ մեկ թող մերոց բարդաբանած եւ մի դանիրս մեզ իփոցություն այլ բրգյազ մեզ իչարե Զիքոյ արքայություն եւ զորություն եւ փառքավիդյանս ամեն սկորդս ցերած մերոց ուղի գարայ մեզ դեր եւ սկորդս ցերած մերոց հացյոյա մեզ դեր ամեն.
Amen. Thank you, Your Eminence. Dear friends, my name is Nishan Basmadjian, Deacon Nishan. I'm the Chancellor of the Diocese of the Armenian Church of Australia and New Zealand and tonight's MC. Allow me to introduce tonight's lecturer, Dr. ROBERTA Irvine. Some of us during the last few years have had the opportunity to join her online lectures about many different topics. I am one of the lucky ones. Dr. ROBERTA Irvine is a prominent scholar specializing in Armenian studies with a particular focus on Armenian Christian history, theology, and the medieval Armenian intellectual tradition. She serves as a professor at St. Nersess Armenian Seminary in Armonk, New York. Dr. Irvine holds a PhD in Armenian studies from Columbia University and has been involved in both teaching and research related to the Armenian Christianity, patristics, and the broader historical and cultural context of the Armenian Church. Her academic work often explores the intersections between Armenian and broader Eastern Christian theological traditions. Beyond her teaching duties, Dr. Irvine is also known for her extensive research and publications including translations of key theological texts and studies on figures like Saint Gregory of Narek. Her contributions have been significant in advancing the understanding of Armenian Christian thought and its place within the wider Christian world. Dr. Irvine is author of numerous books, among others, Worship Traditions in Armenia and the Neighboring Christian East, The Blessing of Blessings, The Armenians in Jerusalem and the Holy Lands, and many more. Speaking about the institution Dr. Irvine teaches, St. Nersess Armenian Seminary, New York. The seminary is an institution dedicated to preparing students for service in the Armenian Apostolic Church, providing them with theological education and personal training. Dr. Irvine's work there is integral to the seminary's mission of preserving and transmitting the Armenian Christian heritage. Prior to teaching at St. Nersess Seminary, Dr. Irvine also taught in Jerusalem's Serpots Tarkmanchats, that is Holy Translators Armenian School, and lectured at other institutions, including the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she lectured 18 years. On June 26th, we had the honor to have Dr. Irvine as our online lecturer. Those who attended the lecture were fascinated. Here she is again for the second lecture. I'm sure it's not going to be the last. This time she will virtually guide us to the Church of Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. There's a lot to say about and to show from this church. Dr. Irvine has a lot to share with us, and I hope we can organize more virtual tours of Jerusalem and Bethlehem in the near future. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. ROBERTA Irvine, Professor.
Thank you, Deacon Nishan. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Very excellent. I'm so pleased and excited that you asked me to come back and talk about one of my favorite subjects. So I'm very, very pleased to be standing here this evening, virtually, at the door of the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem. This doorway and its courtyard may look familiar to some of you because you've been there. And if you haven't been there, welcome to one of the most complicated buildings on the planet. It's so complicated, in fact, that we are going to leave out large parts of it on our little pilgrimage this evening. We're not going to go to the baptistry, the Monastery of Abraham, the Ethiopian chapels and their monastery, the Coptic monastery, and more. So just listening to the names of these places, you know how many things, how many groups, how many different services are take place in this building. It's very amazing to think that this complicated site has been in constant use in one form or another by Christians since the time of Christ's death and resurrection until now, despite regime changes, invasions, wars, persecutions, fires, earthquakes, and the relentless ravages of time passing. It's a miraculous place. It's a miracle that it's still here. And yet, in all the years that I guided pilgrims like yourselves through this building, this complex of buildings. No one ever said to me, this is exactly how I imagined the place of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection would look. This is exactly how I saw it in my mind. No, most people envision something quite different. And over the 20 years that I was there, not one person ever said that. The Holy Sepulchre Church is not a straightforward, user-friendly kind of structure. It was built, destroyed, rebuilt completely, at least 3 times, not counting all of the partial renovations, additions, subtractions that have taken place within smaller parts of the structure. So this is a hodgepodge of architectural elements, remnants of the past, items of the present, all kind of mingle and mix together in this building. But each little piece of this complex has a story. Each element in this mix has a reason for being the way it is. Before we start looking at individual parts of the Holy Sepulchre complex, though, there are 2 things I should show you first. They're both very important because, in part, you can't see the whole structure at once. It's hard to get a grasp of the overall site and its layout. So I would like us to look at it from above before we come back and look at it on the ground. So you can see the tower and the windows below the doorway that we were just standing at. And when you look at it from this vantage point, you can see that there are a lot of different pieces to this. There are 3 different domes. There are a lot of different roof levels. And when we get up a little bit farther, we can see even more kind of inexplicable bits and pieces. And it's very hard to tell, as you can see, where the building starts and where the building stops. So we see things like in front of the tower, there's a big hole in a roof. What's that about? There's a temporary roof off to the right. You can see the white, it's almost built like a tent. You can see that there is a street, narrow street that runs on the left of the screen, goes under an archway, and actually there's a street that runs all the way around the building, and you never actually will see the whole long north side of it because it's completely surrounded by residential and commercial buildings. And those buildings bump up right against the walls of the church. So there is almost no border. You can kind of see where there's a street that runs across the top of the screen. But some of the buildings that are on the right side or the side towards us actually are homes. Some of them share a wall with the church. It's almost as if the people who live there wanted to be as close to the church as they could possibly get. I had a colleague who lived in one of those homes. And through the wall of his living room, which was also the wall of the church, he could hear all of the prayer services, all of the processions. And he and his family were very attached to everything that happened in the structure. So this very dense combination of buildings is not at all how this space looked in Jesus' time. This is not how it looked in the 4th century when Armenian pilgrims began coming here. In Jesus' time, this area was not inside the city of Jerusalem at all. It wasn't very far outside, but it wasn't inside. Do you see on the left of the screen there are stairs that come down, and below the stairs there's kind of a walkway, a road, a very narrow road? That's more or less where the city wall was. So if we locate the crucifixion of Jesus just inside this building, the Romans were not taking any chances on his escaping. They took him probably 40 yards, maybe, outside the city. And this, in fact, is what it looked like where the Holy Sepulchre now sits. That area was a stone quarry. And as I said, it was outside the city wall. And here in this depiction, they've tried to show you how close. On the right, you can see a little piece of city wall. By the time of Jesus, most of this quarry was not in active use. And so it was just sitting there. And you can see on the left, they've hollowed out for you a sample tomb. It would have actually been cut, just a hole cut into that cliff of rock. And there were a number of tombs that had been carved into the rock faces. This was like a new tomb complex outside the city. And in the second circle, you can see the rocky outcropping that the Romans chose as a good place to put up crosses for the public humiliation and punishment of criminals, people whom they felt were not of benefit to society. And with dark humor, they wanted the person dying on the cross to be looking across at the wall of tombs where he or she would soon be. So if you take this quarry with all of its ups and downs and you look at it from an architectural point of view, you go, well, that would be a heck of a basement. That would be a great understory. And in fact, that's what happened. The yellow slab here shows how, more or less, the Holy Sepulchre Church was laid on top of, superimposed on the quarry. And in fact, the Christians weren't the first people to think about putting a building here. When Queen Helena, the mother of Constantine, the first Christian emperor, came to Jerusalem, there was a pagan temple sited exactly like this. And so she and Jerusalem's bishop at the time, Macarius, replaced that pagan temple with a gigantic, magnificent church complex that was designed to stress the support of the empire for the Christian religion, to awe pilgrims with the importance of this place. And so from the market street that you can see to the right, this was the most posh area for shopping in Jerusalem, there was a magnificent, gigantic marble staircase that went up to a courtyard. You can see the arches around the courtyard, kind of a narthex, where pilgrims would enter from the street. Their eyes would adjust to the lower light before they stepped inside the church. The first of the two churches, you can see that they are at 90 degrees to one another. The long church in the front, and behind a shorter church with a dome on the top of it. We're looking at it from a little different angle. In fact, we're looking at it from where we were standing in front of the door. The first church that they went into was toweringly tall. It was 3 stories high, a basilica, meaning a one-piece, straightforward church. The walls were lined in mosaics and gold and crystal. There were intricate stone patterns on the floor. The ceiling overhead was coffered, and it had gold leaf covering everything. And you can see the altar space, the end of that church. There were little niches around it where they had other remaining relics from the Passion, the crown of thorns, the sponge, and so on. And so pilgrims would walk up the length of this basilica, and then there was a door. You can see a little open space towards the very front of the screen next to the altar. Small door, and if a pilgrim walked out through that doorway in the side aisle, he or she would be in the presence of the raw piece of rock that was left to stand there from the original Golgotha, from the original Calvary, part of the rock of that quarry. And the whole atmosphere changed there. Whereas it had been glittering and golden up until that point, the courtyard itself was very peaceful. It was open to the sky. There were trees, there were plants. It was a garden. It was the way that Scripture described the space where Jesus encountered Mary Magdalene after the resurrection. And so standing there in the courtyard under that arcade, or wherever one chose to place oneself, the pilgrim could imagine that he or she was Mary Magdalene, or one of the disciples, awaiting an encounter with the risen Christ. And there were little stairs. There was a railing around the outcropping of rock, and there were little stairs cut into it, so you could climb to the top and touch the holes where the crosses had stood. So having come from all of the gold and the imperial glitter into this very quiet garden space, one felt more prepared to go into the second church. Just a few yards from that Golgotha rock, the tomb stood within its own church, its own space, a space that was actually both square and round. So you can see that the inside of it is a rotunda. And you think back to the picture of the quarry and you go, how in the world did they do that? That whole area is a rock cliff face. Well, Helena's workmen had to remove all of that rock. Very carefully, they removed all of that cliff around the tomb, that rock in which the tomb was carved, and they left just a shell of stone around the tomb itself. And over the top of it, you can see a small picture of it there. Here's a depiction of it on a piece of glass that was part of a souvenir of the place. You can see that there's a kind of a pavilion, an umbrella thing. There are pillars. There's a little porch in the front of it. You can see the low tomb door behind. Inside, if you went through the door, was the stone funeral bench on which the body of Jesus was laid. There was part of the rock on which the angel sat to give the good news to those who came to the tomb. Here's an artist's rendition of what it might have looked like. And there was an opening, an oculus, directly above it to let in light. So from time to time, quite magically, I imagine, there would be a ray of light that would descend directly onto the tomb. Well, one of the problems when you build a magnificent structure with gold and crystal and mosaics and things is it's a very big temptation. And Helena's wonderful structures with their gold and their mosaics are all gone now. Well, I shouldn't say they're all gone because you can still see little parts of the staircase. As it doesn't look like a staircase, right? But if you come out of the Holy Sepulchre Church and you go down into the market, this building, which is a Russian convent, and if somebody's there to let you in, you will still see part of the staircase. This is one of the arches from part way up the staircase. And Armenians actually had pilgrim accommodations, pilgrim hostels, pilgrim little hotels for the wealthier pilgrims, right at the foot of that staircase. So with Helena's church gone, just bits of it left, the whole thing was rebuilt in the 11th century. But it was rebuilt, you can see it's not long like Helena's church was. It was rebuilt more on a square plan. What they did was just to cut off the space where the basilica had once been. You can see that there's a wall at the bottom of the picture. Beyond that is where Helena's church would have been. It was a low budget time. And this was better than nothing. It was great to be able to have Christian worship again in the space. But not too long after that, when the Crusaders came, they did somewhat better. They turned Helena's garden, the space between the tomb, computer's being very sensitive this morning, the space between the tomb at the top and the crucifixion off to the side, they turned that whole garden space into a cathedral. They didn't put walls around it, which caused architectural problems. They didn't put walls around it. They wanted to keep that open space, but they put a very large altar into it. They made the basement of Helena's basilica into the basement of a new, very lovely monastery that was joined to the cathedral by some chapels, and that was where the monks lived who cared for the church. And if you look at the plan, you think, well, that looks a lot like a keyhole. I think that was intentional. And St. Peter, in the time of the Crusades, definitely held the key. This change of plan was very ambitious. And the south wall of the church, the wall to the left of that picture, was not able to actually hold the weight that was added to the structure, causing a problem. The whole front of the church, as we were looking at it, that whole entranceway began to bow out. So what do you do when you've made a mistake in your structure? Well, they added to the left a bell tower to hold up that end of the wall. So automatically, what had been a flat facade now became obstructed. They added a bell tower. The bell tower was originally much taller than that, but you can see that the arches of the door and the arches of the window above it go behind that bell tower. They originally were bigger. The bell tower is now holding up one end of the building. And then on the other side, you can see a stairway with a little chapel at the top, holding up another section of the front. And later, the building that you're looking at was also constructed. So that little chapel at the top of the stairs is very interesting. If you go up the stairs, which you can do, and you press your nose against the glass at the top, you can see that inside the chapel is a beautiful golden altar in memory of the Mater Dolorosa, the suffering Virgin Mary. And then if you turn your head to the left, still kind of squishing yourself against the window, you can see that there was a beautifully carved doorway that led directly from the top of those stairs into the Golgotha chapels at the top, the Calvary chapels, the place of the crucifixion. So the rock is no longer there. Instead, for the convenience of people who want to worship there, there's been a floor added. There's been a chapel constructed. So you used to be able to go into the church this way, especially if you were a higher ranking clergyman. This is how they would bring you into the church. But we can't get there from here anymore. So we are going to have to go back down those little stairs and go around and come in through the front door. But before we do that, actually, I want to share with you an interesting little Armenian story. When you look at the east wall of the courtyard, you can see that there was once a massive archway on that wall. There's a place right above where the people are sitting that you can detect in the wall itself a range of stones that are different and that form a large arch. And in fact, that stone that the pilgrims are sitting on, people often do that. This is a tiring place to visit. When you take a close look at it, you go, wait a minute, that's a pillar. And people don't normally move pillars very far from where they're located. The things are very heavy. So this has fallen over and it's just simply been incorporated into a seat. And right next to that seat, right next to that pillar, looking a little bit more towards the foreground, was the door of an Armenian closet. And people were so used to that closet being there that they didn't think, what the heck is a closet doing in the courtyard of this church? Right above where the people are sitting, there were two little horns of stone that protruded from the wall. And when the superior at the time had those horns exposed, here you can see the archway really clearly. When those little protrusions of stone were exposed, lo and behold, there was another column embedded in the wall. So that was one of the ones that held up the arch. The one on the other side is gone because there's now a window there. Well, that was very interesting. It turned out that the Armenian closet was actually the altar apse of a small basilica church that once stood in this courtyard. And so they emptied out the closet, found the rest of the apse. Now it's a functioning church. Very early pilgrims, 8th century pilgrims perhaps, who saw this little basilica when it was still up, said that it commemorated the spot where John and Mary had stood at the crucifixion when Jesus told John, "Behold your mother," and he told Mary, "Behold your son." He committed her care to John. So that's just a little piece of Armenian trivia. Actually, it's not trivial from this site. So anyway, shall we go inside?
We do.
Yeah, let's go. But before, look at that doorway, look at that closely. It's got this beautiful, very elegant carving around the archways. And then the center of the tympanum, as it's called, that triangular area above the door, and the lintels above the door are bare. It's not what you expect. You look at a European cathedral, that's not what you see. And there are marks on the lintels above the door, like there were iron pieces attached to it at one point. So that's a little bit strange. The Crusaders had mosaics in those tympana, in those triangular spaces, and they also had fantastically carved lintels over the door. Those have been taken off and placed for safekeeping in the Rockefeller Museum near the Damascus Gate. But I can show you what they looked like. In fact, they were on the church into the 20th century before they were removed for safekeeping. This is the one that stood above that bricked in or stoned in doorway. And these lintels together, both sides, show very clearly how the Crusaders thought a face-to-face physical encounter with the death and resurrection of Christ would change a pilgrim's life. All pilgrims entered the sacred precinct of the crucifixion and the resurrection through this door. And the carving over this lintel looked really beautiful. It's a wonderful vine. It looked beautiful until you notice that there are humans and animals struggling in the grasp of that vine. The toils and snares of a sinful world are holding them very tightly. They are all in pain. They are suffering. So underneath this kind of metaphorical representation of their life, pilgrims would enter the church. And then after they had gone around the inside, after they had visited Golgotha and the tomb, they would come out again through the other side of the doorway. So it was kind of crowd control at the same time. And over that doorway are depicted scenes from the life of Christ. Everything is very orderly. Everyone is upright. People are calm. There's healing scenes going on. And at the very right end of it, you're not sure whether it looks like the Last Supper, but it also represents the feast in God's kingdom. And so the pilgrim went in through a door that showed disorder, pain, and suffering in the world, and came out through a depiction of how the life of Christ had brought healing and order to that world. So we are lucky these days to find the church open, at least the one door of it. This was not always the case. Very often, pilgrims have made the whole journey to Jerusalem. Some of them have come to the Holy Sepulchre Church on their knees, only to find that the tomb is inaccessible. And even now, there are times when it is closed. The Muslim gatekeepers, who for centuries have been in charge of opening and closing the church, do close it at night and on special occasions. Those are the keys. But today, the door is open. And as we step across the threshold, even before we're fully inside the church, we're aware of all of the Armenians who have preceded us. Because on the pillars beside that open door are carved graffiti. You can see graffiti in Syriac, you can see graffiti in other languages. Up at the top on the left side pillar, you can see Armenian. Some of them are like this one. This person, the servant of God, Tatul, obviously had more time with the pillar and some good tools. That's still a very clear inscription. Then just inside the door, the first thing that greets us is a wave of cool air that carries the church's distinctive fragrance. The church hits you in the face with this breath of old stone, rose water, burning beeswax, cleaning supplies, and incense. It's unlike anything anywhere else. And directly in front of us when we enter the church was once that open, arcaded garden between Calvary on the right and the tomb to the left. Now our line of sight into that garden space is blocked by the wall of what was the Crusaders' cathedral. Now it's a Greek Orthodox church, and they have chosen to decorate the outer wall of it with a very elaborate mosaic with marble framing that shows Jesus being taken down from the cross. And the subject is appropriate because right in front of that mosaic lies the stone of unction, as it's called, the stone of anointing, marking the spot where Jesus's body may have been placed when it came down from the cross to be wrapped before it was put in the tomb. This slab of stone is the first thing that's venerated by pilgrims who enter the church. Everyone, from ordinary individuals from all over the world to the Pope himself, to the clergy who go in and out and serve this church every day, everyone pauses to greet this stone and its meaning. And the lamps that hang above the stone represent the faith of the three communities, the Greeks, the Armenians, and the Roman Catholics, who keep the church in order, keep the lamps burning, care for the upkeep of things in general. And from the bottom of each lamp hangs a little triangle that identifies which group it belongs to. So this stone of unction, this thing placed right at the entrance to the garden, what was once the garden space, is a perfect place to stop for a second and get our bearings before we go anywhere else in the church. So we're going to step just a little bit aside from the stone, and we're going to look up. You can see the lamps still hanging there at the bottom right, and the mosaic to your left. So when you look up, you begin to get a glimpse of how complex this church really is. It almost makes you a little bit dizzy. On the lower level, you can see there's a kind of a pink marble balustrade, like you would find at a set of stairs. It's a few feet above our heads, and you can see above it is a lamp hanging in the lighted chapel of the Crucifixion. And that chapel occupies one of 3 identical Gothic archways. Above those 3 arches, there are 2 more with a little balcony in front of them. We're not going to have access to those areas. And then above, at the very top, there's a pair of windows. And if you kind of imagine craning your neck around a little bit to look up to the right, you can see at the level of the balcony an open archway with light coming in. And there are metal grills in front of it that have Armenian-looking birds as their motif. Here we can look at it from a little bit different angle. You can see the birds better. This gallery that stands above the main entrance to the church on that wall that leans outward belongs to the Armenians, who call it Second Golgotha. There's a long story behind that, of course. We bring our eyes back down to ground level. If we look to the west, to our right, past the stone of anointing, we can see a large archway that was once part of the church around the tomb. And that archway supports another piece of the Armenian gallery. And in the background, you can see a staircase leading upwards. So the Armenian gallery is in 2 parts, kind of wraps around. If we turn the opposite direction from the stone, if we're standing inside that archway and we look out across the stone of unction towards the east, we can see that there's a passageway that leads from the Calvary Chapel, the Crucifixion Chapel up above, into the deeper interior of the church. And we will go there. But before we go, we're going to take a step closer to the stone of unction. You can see the passageway. You can see the chapel of the Crucifixion. And then if we turn ourselves just a little bit more toward the doorway that we came in through into the church, we see a set of stairs. And those stairs are actually where we are going next. If we walk across to the stairs, we notice that it's rather odd. The stones to the right of that staircase are the stones of the closed doorway. So the stairs are blocking the doorway. They're clearly not old. They're not back to the Crusader period. In the Crusader period, that doorway was open. So in the Ottoman times when the door was closed, these stairs were built because they expanded the size of the Crucifixion Chapel up above. There were so many people coming, there was need for a bigger worship space at the top. And so it pushed itself out into the entry space. And even though these stairs are not that old, you can see here the closed part of the door very clearly. Even though these stairs are not that old, they're very worn, a testament to the number of feet that have gone up them, as we are going to do now. And when we emerge at the top of this stairway, we see that in fact there are two chapels up there, completely different in style from one another. The chapel that's closest to us is the Roman Catholic chapel of the Crucifixion. Its incredible mosaics with their celestial blue background tell stories from Adam to the crucifixion. And the pristinely maintained floor does date to the time of the Crusades. In fact, the door from the stairs to that little chapel of the Mother of Sorrows is just off the line of vision in this picture. So contrast that with the other chapel. This has a very different feeling to it. The majority of pilgrims who climb these stairs come not to visit the Roman Catholic chapel, although they do that, but they come to visit this Greek one. Specifically, they want to visit the two glass boxes that you see flanking that strangely high kind of altar table. As you come closer to those two glass boxes, you can see that they cover rock. They cover the top of the rock that used to stand in the open in the garden space, and pilgrims will stand in line for a chance to bend down in a graphic kind of act of humility, get underneath the altar where there is a hole. You can see it at the back, just in front of the icon. It's in an awkward location on purpose. That hole is completely covered, sided with marble. And without being able to see into the hole, without being able to really see what they are doing, pilgrims put their hand into the hole and they touch the rock. They touch this, a hole chipped into the rock at the top of Calvary, at the top of Golgotha, a hole that is centered between the two glass encased pieces of rock, the hole where the vertical piece of the cross would have stood. And sometimes pilgrims are told that this crack in the rock is a result of the earthquake that took place at the crucifixion. Well, it's hard to imagine all of that rocky outcropping, that Calvary that you used to be able to climb up, the actual rock. It's difficult to imagine that, but this isn't all that remains of it. The rock is larger than it looks here. If we turn to the left and we walk behind this altar into a storage space, you can see the back wall of the altar, the back wall of that chapel is there. And if you look down through the railing, this railing didn't used to be there. You used to take your life in your hands coming back here. If you look down, this is going to be an awkward shot, but if you look down, you can see right almost in the center, there's a dip in the rock. That's the entrance to a small cave, a cave that's called the Cave of Adam's Skull. And sometimes in depictions of the crucifixion, you will see a skull at the bottom of the cross, the foot of the cross, representing this cave, representing the tradition that Christ was crucified on the same spot where Adam was buried. And then if we go back out to the front of the chapel, and we descend by this very steep staircase, we can follow that rock even further, because right beneath where we were standing is a chapel that's called the Chapel of Adam. And you can see in the background, there's a window in the wall of the chapel. And through that window, you can see a crack, a little opening that is actually part of that cave, part of the cave of Adam's skull. And there's more of the rock to be seen too. If we leave the Adam Chapel, by the door that you can see on the left, and if we turn to the right, like this monk is in the process of doing, he's coming out of that same door, and we follow this little procession of Franciscan clergy and their cat. On the right, we can see a kind of bump out in the wall with a plexiglass front. And behind that glass is more of the Calvary rock. You can view it from all three sides. It's covered in plexiglass because people were taking pieces of it home. And looking at this, we begin to have an idea of how crumbly, how friable this particular piece of rock was. Not usable for building. And so Christians associated it immediately with the prophecy that said the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. And they found that very meaningful. So following our little procession past this rock, we find ourselves in a passageway that runs around the back of the Crusader church and at the bottom of the keyhole. This passage houses several chapels that are dedicated to smaller moments in the crucifixion story. And we're not going to visit those, but as you can see in the wall on the right, just a little bit ahead, there's a doorway. And that doorway is very ancient. In fact, we are about to enter what was the basement of Helena's church, a basement that the Crusaders had incorporated again into the complex. Armenians come here on a daily basis to incense this chapel together with others. And they come again on Fridays as part of a longer procession. So we step through that doorway onto a long, broad staircase. The walls of this staircase are marked with an abundance of pilgrim graffiti. It's almost as though a person coming on the pilgrimage would make a cross in the wall, if they could afford to have someone do it, for each person who was unable to come. Or each member of a group would have a cross in their memory, their anonymous memory. And at the foot of the stairs, we see the pillars and the mosaic floor of the Armenian chapel of St. Gregory the Illuminator, a chapel everybody else calls the Chapel of St. Helena. The mosaic on the floor looks old, but it was added in the late 20th century restoration of this chapel. And it shows, I should have a close-up of it, shows the churches of the earliest Armenian Christianity, Megayane and so on. And if we walk forward into the Tas, right in front of the main altar of the chapel. So here's a little bit of a close-up. If we walk into the TOS right in front of the main altar and we look to the left, there's a screened door. There's another one behind the altar. And if pilgrims are lucky enough to find someone who has the keys to this space and is willing to open it, what lies behind it is extraordinary. Over a number of years, the Armenians emptied out this space, removing tons of loose fill. And when they took out those loose remains, they discovered that there was a whole section of the Helena church's understory and parts of the pagan temple as well. And so when you come through the door, you come down the stairs, you see that there are stones and structures from all different periods of the lowest parts of the church. And into this space, the Armenians built an altar to Saint Vartan, for whom the space is now named. It's the Vartan Chapel. This space is really large, remarkably large. And supporting that reinforced ceiling, you can see pieces of stone from the quarry. And beyond it, you can see more architectural elements from the pagan temple and from Helena's church. On the wall to the right, behind that frame that you can see, is a graffito on a little bit of plaster that was left on the wall. And it shows a ship. It's been darkened over as people were trying to figure out what exactly it was. It shows a ship with its mast down, a ship that has come to port, and underneath it in Latin is a quotation from one of the Pilgrim Psalms. So at some point in the very early history of this church, a grateful pilgrim or his group had celebrated their arrival. Now, this excavation behind the Armenian altar goes to several levels. Once they started emptying out, they kept wondering, well, what's next? Until they almost broke through into someone else's monastery. What you're looking into is what may have been part of the cisterns that served the church. There's large places where you could have kept quite a bit of water, and there are pipes. There's a huge quantity of bits of pottery, remaining little interesting debris that still lies around the bottom of this excavated space. So that's something to see the next time you're in the city. When we come back out into the Adyan, into the main part of the St. Gregory Chapel, we notice that through the altar, there's this really bright, shining light. And just next to it is a window. You can see that's also very light. From this window, according to tradition, St. Helena watched the workmen down below as they were digging around hunting for the cross. And we can actually go down there. Just to the right of the mosaic, you can see the start of a staircase that goes down into that deep area that Helena was looking into, the space where the cross was found. And all around this space, as you begin to look around you and notice, are the quarry marks, the places where big slabs and blocks of rock were carried out and removed. So the quarry that was here in the time of Christ is still plainly visible if you know where to look for it. But we will walk back up the stairs towards the main level of the church, and we will turn right into that passageway with the rest of the small chapels. Like I said, we're not going to stop at them, but when you get just beyond them, when you get around the curve that you can see there, there's another chapel known as the Prison of Christ, a place where he was held according to tradition before the crucifixion actually began. And in front of that chapel, with its 3 altars, in front of that chapel, there's a table with a glass front. You can see that there are 2, they don't quite match. The one on the right is something special. And if you look into that glass enclosure, there are 2 holes, and pilgrims are often told that Jesus's feet were restrained in these. But in this church, holes like that are there to allow the pilgrim to glimpse something important that's no longer accessible. So if it were possible to get under this table, and it used to actually be possible, you could look through those holes and see the top of a staircase that went down to a lower level cloister where people serving the church lived. If we turn away from the prison, we are on the north side of that central church space. There's almost never any traffic on this side of the space. Yet it's very interesting. This is called the Arches of the Virgin. And it's a passage that leads from the prison chapel westward towards what is now the central Roman Catholic worship area of the church. When you come out of this passage, you are in the only part of the garden space that's left, really. And the altar here commemorates the place where Jesus encountered Mary Magdalene on the morning of the resurrection. Behind the bronze doors lies the very serene and beautiful primary Roman Catholic chapel for the church. If we were to turn around, there are others in the church. If we were to turn around from here, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it. If you were to turn around, you would see the Crusader staircase behind us that the Roman Catholic Patriarch would have used to enter the church from his private residence when this was just a chapel in the church. This Mary Magdalene space opens onto what is now the rotunda, the great space around and above the tomb of Christ. And our first glimpse of this rotunda that surrounds the tomb isn't that different. Oops, why is this going backwards? Okay, isn't that different from the space that surrounded the tomb in Constantine's day, Helena's day, even though the tomb shape has changed? Even now, the rotunda rises to its original 3-story height. But today, not all of the columns, not all of the pillars are in the same style. See, some are original, some are not. And not all of the arches are open. A lot of them have been closed, again, to create private spaces behind them. And yet, each one of the 3 major communities has maintained some of the arches in their open state, because these are perfect spots for watching services take place below. There's a lot of hubbub and noise down below, but if you have a gallery space, you can watch everything that goes on in relative comfort. Armenians have this too. Now, normally, in the early days, people would have walked around the tomb behind those pillars. There was a full walkway back there, and the whole space around the tomb would have been kind of private space for the tomb itself. But now rooms, you can see there's a building behind the columns. Rooms and other things have been built into that space. Rooms that accommodate, here you can see them from above, rooms that accommodate the people who serve this church, who might be closed in, especially in Ottoman times, for a long period of time. And so pilgrims today walk around in the space directly by the tomb. So we're going to do that. And as we move towards the back of the tomb, we see that there is a structure protruding out from the back of the tomb. It has a kind of a leather covering over it. It's like, what is this? This is the Coptic chapel of the tomb. It's a warm, almost a cozy little space where the Coptic clergy hold daily services. It's not room for them inside, so they hold them outside. And inside this very small space, with its abundant decoration, there sits almost always a priest who will very happily share with you the reason why this tiny spot, you could make the argument, is the most important place in the church at present. Because under its altar, behind a curtain, he's opened the curtain so you can see, is the only place where a pilgrim can now touch the actual rock of the original tomb. Farther along the rotunda to the east is a low door, which you can see on the left of the picture, into the chapel of the Syrian Orthodox. The chapel, it's got different names: Chapel of Joseph of Arimathea, the Chapel of the Tomb of Nicodemus. Local faithful people come to this space for services. Pilgrims come to this space for this, a hole in the wall through which it's possible to squeeze, entering into the space of a first-century tomb. This is the only tomb besides the tomb of Christ in the church, and it was left intact in order to demonstrate that, yes, the space where Christ's tomb is now isolated was indeed part of a complex of tombs, and thus it had to be outside the city. As we continue around the rotunda and approach the front of the tomb, we find ourselves at the entrance to the Crusader Cathedral, to the Greek Orthodox Church as it is now, that enclosed that once open, airy space between the cross and the tomb. This is called the Katholikon. It's the heart of Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox, etc., worship in the church. Through that archway, which is actually holding up a bigger structure, the colored marble floor leads like a carpet to the iconostasis and the great altar, passing by a little structure that marks the center of the world. And so just imagine, if you can, that whenever a priest is celebrating at the great altar, whether it's the Roman Catholic altar that was once here, the Greek Orthodox altar that's there now, turning to bless the people, the priest will be looking directly at the door of the tomb itself. It must have been a thrill. For pilgrims, sometimes entering the tomb is not possible. Just as the church may sometimes be closed, so rather randomly is the tomb itself. Sometimes there is a service taking place, and it's hard to get through. But when one can get into the tomb, it's a magical thing. To walk up that mosaic carpeted platform where the tomb sits. To look up at the oculus, the opening, the eye, if you like, of the restored dome, whose light changes across the days and the seasons, but it always illuminates some part of this structure. So when Armenians wrote poetry about the light from the tomb, this is part of what they were thinking of. Waiting to enter the tomb, we stand between gigantic candle stands, again belonging to the three communities, and we stand below rows of hanging lamps that likewise mark the three communities' commitment to keep the light from the tomb burning. When we finally enter the door, we are in the dark, quiet space, together with the remnant of a stone, the stone where the angel sat, a reminder of our calling as Christians to share the news of the resurrection light. Beyond the angel's rock, the tomb itself, with its much smaller door, becomes visible. It's a place that a pilgrim has to enter with humility. It's not possible to stand up and go through that doorway. And then inside, under the watchful eye of a Greek priest, pilgrims can finally kneel in the cramped, narrow space before the funerary bench, surrounded by candles and lights, again representing the three communities and their commitment to this place. Although Christians who worship here were not surprised at this, it was still kind of nice to know that in the course of recent reconstruction and repair work on the church, Workmen removed the marble slab covering the tomb, and they discovered that there really is a rock bench beneath it, and there really is a shell of rock surrounding it. Pilgrims aren't allowed to linger long in the tomb. And so we too are going to exit the church through the pillars on the right. You can see the entrance to the Greek church. You can see the Coptic chapel at the back. We're going to go out through those open pillars to the right. And pass by the Armenian altar of the myrrh-bearing women. As we do so, we catch tantalizing glimpses of the Armenian Descharan, the stairs leading up to the Armenian gallery, the second Golgotha. And we know that we will not have time to visit them today, but we know that they are there. But it's time to leave because the doors are open and other pilgrims, together with the faithful, in this case, of the Armenian quarter, are arriving in order to spend their precious moment in this most sacred and ancient space. Thank you for visiting it together with me this evening.
Oh, thank you. Amazing, Professor. Fascinating.
It's quite a place.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Wow. Wow. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, please ask Dr. Cebecian. Unmute, please.
And you may also ask in Armenian if you're more comfortable that way.
Yeah, anyway, anybody who wants to...
Either language.
Yeah, either language, yes.
Շնորհակալություն այս խոսակցության եւ դվյանները, որ դվիկ պրոֆեսոր Էրվայն շատ աստվեցա, որովհետեւ մայիս 2018-ին այս սրբավայրը ներկա եղանք եւ այդ թուրը մուտքի թուրը կոչվեցավ եւ մենք ներս մնացինք այդ գիշեր հոյագապ գիշեր էր կես գիշերը ունական պատարակ եղավ հետո հայկականը առավոտ ժամը 3-4 դպավորությունները անմոռանալի են եւ ցգյանս կմնան հոգի մեջ Մի հարցնեի երկու բան որ the cave of the patriarchs բանի մեջ է Հեբրոնի մեջ բաս եկեսո մեջ cave of Adam գա որոշ քրություններ գսեն որ աթամը cave of patriarch-ի մեջ էր չեմ գիտեցեր գազիկի
We don't know is the ultimate answer but you can see the reason why people would want to think of him as buried in the cave of Adam or at least his head to be buried. Okay, Hebron can have the body, but at least the head needs to be in the Holy Sepulchre Church because there's this beautiful kind of symmetry that's created with the thought of Jesus being crucified on that spot.
Եվ բիդիսեի որ Գրիգոր նայեցին At panin vora krazi որ առաջին աթամը եւ ինչպես երկրորդ աթամը նույն դեղեն այսին մեկ մյուսին վրա at ռուչունը գա իր panin մեջ մադյանի մեջ շնորհակալություն խորին շնորհակալություն
Thank you, Dr. Cebecian. Yeah, other questions? Yes, Mr. Zaven. Unmute, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Professor Irvine, thank you very much first for this lecture. You spoke about the three communities that are in the structure, in the church.
There are more communities that worship in the structure. Those are the three that divide the cost of maintaining.
Right. Now, what are the relationship between these three communities? Because from what we see sometimes in the news and sometimes in documentaries, there are fights and struggles and all kinds of things that are going on.
Sometimes there are. You know, it's like any family, you fight. Especially if you're in a sharing space. You just imagine what it would be like in your home church if you had 7 or 8 different denominations worshiping simultaneously in the space. There's going to be friction.
But
The miracle of it is that it works 98% of the time. And things are maintained. There have to be regular meetings about anything, electricity, plumbing, fixing a hole in all of that stuff. It has to be done together. Each community can do whatever it wants in its own space. So the Greeks were able to put up whatever mosaic they wanted in their part of the church. Armenians are able to put up whatever mosaics they want in their part of the church. Nobody interferes. But in all of the common spaces, they have to work together. There's no other way. And so each one of them is kind of a balance for the other one. They support and they balance.
right.
So everybody gets a chance to be in the space. Everybody gets a chance to care for the space.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. Now, Professor, one more question. I'm referring to a statement you made in your last lecture.
See if I
Where
remember
you
it.
mentioned a statement going like, what you see today, you will not see tomorrow. Now, the question is, if anything does happen with this unpredictable situation in Israel, if anything is to happen to the Armenian quarters, is there any support from other churches, other denominations, to intervene and help the Armenian quarters from Israeli, let's say, occupation or whatever they want to do?
Usually there is. Usually the churches will stand together. This hasn't always been the case, but more often than not it is, where one Christian group will support another Christian group. And there have been statements made by the Roman Catholic Patriarch, by the Greek Patriarch, in support of Armenians, and vice versa. When there have been issues in one of their constituencies, the Armenians have also spoken up. So, you do what you can to
Excellent.
to have one another's back.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you indeed.
Thank you, Baron Zaven. Are there other questions?
Looks like there might
Yes,
be one.
Leila. Unmute. Unmute, please.
No, that's it. Yeah, you mentioned about some of the crusaders going on their knees. How far would they have gone on their knees?
From the city gate.
Uh-huh.
So probably half a mile.
Okay.
Yeah, it was. So for one period of time, Armenian nuns in the city took it upon themselves to make sure that, since a lot of pilgrims were coming on their knees, there were no rocks, no little stones, no gravel. And they would go out every morning and sweep the whole roadway from the gate of the city down to the church.
Oh. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Leila. You made it, huh?
Yep. We
Great.
finished early.
Great, great. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. If no other questions, then I will request His Eminence to say a few words.
Before I say a few words, I have a question, actually.
Okay, that's great.
Because Holy Sepulchre is from the early 4th century, and the Armenian presence been there from probably from that period as well. So I assume that from time to time the Armenians have lost certain chapels or acquired others. We didn't hear anything like that in the lecture because I was once I was visiting it's called Kokhota or whatever the Greek chapel on the right side. They said that it was burned, and before it was burned, we had a either altar or something there, but we lost it. I don't know why we lost it at the time. Probably we couldn't renovate it or whatever, so it was gone. Anything like that? Do we know any other?
Yes, we do. We know the Armenians, because the Armenians were in on the ground floor of Christianity, they were actually Christian just before Constantine made his public decision. They were among, and Armenia was a very wealthy, large country at the time. They were involved in the ground floor process of all of the building that went on in Jerusalem. And so the Golgotha Chapel, that the Calvary Rock Chapel, was theirs in the beginning. And then over time, changes in government supported different groups. And so there was high support for the Georgians at one point, and the Georgians were awarded that chapel. And the Armenians protested, as you can imagine, they protested very strongly. The Georgians soon lost the chapel to the Greeks. They're Orthodox kind of overseers. And the Armenians, in compensation for having given up the chapel, unwillingly though it was, were given the gallery. And so it's called the second Golgotha because one wall of the Armenian upstairs chapel adjoins the Golgotha chapel. So they share a wall. And it actually worked out well for the Armenians from the point of view of worship because there's a lot more space in that gallery. On the other hand, it would still be nice to have the Calvary Rock, but okay. History is what it is.
So my assumption is that there will be another lecture, right? This is not the end of our tour.
That is entirely up to the diocese.
Because we didn't end in a way. It was kind of not finished. There is so much.
Yeah, there are at least 6 monasteries in that building that we didn't see.
Even the Armenian
Usually,
side properly.
Exactly.
One thing, if I may say, the pictures, the slides or whatever they are very small. Can we enlarge it or whatever, because it's so hard to see in the way it was done. I didn't want to touch anything, being afraid that I might lose, the whole thing. So is it possible to enlarge it so that we can see more?
It will get the size of your computer screen.
I see. Okay.
Not beyond that. If you have,
No,
if you
not
have
beyond that,
screen,
because it was a very small part of, as small as your picture is. I mean, currently when we look.
No, that should not be the case. It should be the size of your screen.
Okay, because sometimes we were referring.
There's an adjustment you can
Some
make.
people are sitting, I've been looking, where are these?
No. It's supposed to cover your entire screen.
So we hope that then we'll be having other lectures and in detail, even to know, because Holy Sepulchre is ecumenical international Christian church, cathedral, even to learn to see others, if not ours, but still there is so much to learn and to benefit out of it. Because as was mentioned from outside, hardly you can make up what it's in it, how it's been divided, subdivided, and so forth. So we thank Professor for this beautiful lecture tour, and we look forward every time, whenever, as I said, every time when you speak, when you say something, the angle, the approach is such that it makes things very interesting, and every time we learn something new. And I hope that those people who have not gone to Jerusalem or a pilgrimage, hopefully in the near future, when things are quieted down and peaceful, this will be for them a motivation to go and visit and to see, because to visit Armenia, to be on our own homeland in a way, is a different feeling. Here in the Christian center of the world, when you see what our forefathers, what have achieved, I mean, to see this every other candle in these international places, the second is Armenian. Every second lantern is Armenian with Armenian writing on it and so forth. So you feel so proud by the achievements. Yes, maybe in the 4th century, I don't know how big Armenia was or influential it was, but through the sacrifices throughout the centuries, Armenians maintained these rights and this chapel, whatever remained as time went by. Still, we are so much proud to see these Armenian artifacts. Some of the earlier inscriptions, mosaics, survived in Jerusalem rather than in Armenia. So it's fascinating that the link between Armenia and Jerusalem being so close, so tight throughout the centuries. And I'm not surprised that the Armenians sacrifice so much to preserve. And even today, when there are certain difficulties, I'm pretty sure we will overcome these difficulties, and the Armenian quarter will be there as it used to be during the Crusaders, even before that, during the Arabs' arrival there, and so forth. And we just again and again amazed with this achievement. And thank you, Professor ERVINE, for reigniting that light in our hearts to be proud as Christians and as Armenians. It's not just to say that we are the first Christian Armenian nation to embrace Christianity as a state religion, but to see the sacrifices, the commitments, generation after generation. There was no aeroplanes at the time to go and visit, or buses or trains or whatever. They had sometimes it will take more than a year to go as a pilgrim, to go and visit and to return. And if they manage to return, that's another issue. Or and sometimes I hear stories that Armenian pilgrims went there on the road. They were the thieves and attacked them, and they took everything from them. So when they arrived as pilgrims, they didn't have anything to give to the monastery. Contrary, the monks have to help these victims to make sure that they return eventually to their homes safe and sound. So thank you so much. If I can finish with a prayer. Անունհոր եւ Որդու եւ Ոգուն Սրբո ամեն Բահաբան ամենայնի Քրիստոս Աչկովանի դիցի վերայիմ իդվե եւ քիշերի ինստիլիդան իքնալի ջանաբար ինընչել եւ հառնել զիմիերփեք սասանեցայց եւ օրմիա կորարածոց եւ ինձ բազմամեղիս. Amen. Thank you. Next time.